As a new co-chair, I officially call this meeting to order. So the first item on the agenda is public comment. Do we have any guests in the room or in the Zoom that would like to provide public comment?
Like on Zoom, nothing via the form online.
Okay, sorry, it's okay. Nadia has a wonderful agenda and I'm trying to follow, to make sure I follow along. Okay. So next up we'll do is our roll call. I'm going to read off everyone's names, and if you don't mind just saying you're here, that'd be lovely. Bruce Dickinson.
Here.
Thank you, Bruce. Chris Iosa. Dave Bachman. Dina. Thank you. Myself. John.
Yes.
Thank you. Chriselle Lucas.
I'm here.
Thank you. Lang Kimley Crew. Is he still an attendee?
Yeah, it looks like we promoted, he is a comment.
Okay. Thank you. Nathan Teskey.
Here.
Nina Stanford.
Here.
Stafford, I'm sorry, Nina. Paul Cummings. Nope.
Here.
Oh, thank you, Paul. I looked at your name card over here, sorry. And Ryan Kane.
I'm here.
Thank you, Ryan.
No, thank you. Appreciate you going through this for the first time.
My pleasure. So moving forward, do we have any members of the HAC who would have updates that they'd like to share with the group this morning related to the work we do? If no updates, I'm not hearing anyone has updated, so we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is an executive director report.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Happy May. This is really a season, I gotta say, a season of some major milestones that I would like to highlight for you all. Particularly actually folks around this room. And I really do think just in this moment, it's been 2.5 years since I've started. We really are showing, I think we're showing our strength and we're showing the power of partnerships. And in that spirit, I just wanted to highlight a couple kind of milestone moments for some of you. So first of all, express the deep gratitude for Paul Cummings, who just announced his semi-retirement from being as the National Housing Affordable Housing Trust as a longtime syndicator. And I just want to do a shout out for Paul, who's really been a huge fundraiser and supporter of affordable housing for your 30 years, Paul, running with for shelter, running Hood to Coast, fundraising for a lot of local groups, but also national groups that have really been a national leader. And so congratulations on your next phase, Paul.
Thank
maybe
you,
more
Mom.
running, maybe less working.
Thank you.
And just glad you're continuing on with us. We're very grateful to have such great expertise here in Washington County. Speaking of milestones, I am thrilled to share with you all that I think we might have achieved a new milestone for the Housing Authority of Washington County, and that we found out that we will be recommended for a 9% low-income housing tax credit award for our first time. So that's, I think, our first time.
Really?
I know, Nathan's
They're
like,
9%
that's so old fashioned.
Great, yay.
Well, a lot more to, no, not trying to catch up. It's not a competition. But it does speak to just a lot of change and growth for us, and how do we move a project forward? And this project is our Forest Grove Permanent Supportive Housing Project, which with our 9% will end up being a 45-unit PSH project. And along those same lines, I'm thrilled to announce for you all that we did have an intent to award an architect who's someone in this room. So Scott Edwards Architecture with Haley Purdy here for that project. And then we will also, did select behavioral health provider, Fancy and Hope, also not in this room today, but on this committee with Dina Castron. So that's why, I just think it's really, so this says a lot for, how we really built, a momentum here, starting here in this room. Yeah, very exciting. We were able to share with our board recently, Board of County Commissioners, more updates on the affordable housing bond. You'll hear more updates from Lisa later. I'm just really thrilled to share that we now officially have 13 projects, not just 12. I think 13 is a very auspicious number. And that's because we were officially got the Forest Grove project approved by Metro. Through all that. And so we're over our now total production goals is exceeds 1,000. Also kind of a nice auspicious number. We're exceeding 1,000, of course, as you know, that means thousands of households will eventually be housed in this housing. 10 of the projects are already open, 2 are in construction and 1 in pre-development. So we are just moving along with our Metro bond goals. So really thrilled about that. Also happy to share with you all, we're about halfway through our renovation of Woodspring Apartments preservation project. So that's always big deal when you're taking a siding down and you're looking into things to be able to reach this milestone. Walsh is our general contractor, so we're in really good hands. We feel we now have a pretty good sense, and all those that work is underway. And I wanted to share with you, we're continuing to do engagement of our transitional housing projects, particularly the Cornell Road recovery. And I want to invite you all, if you wanted to come, there's another community or a Good Neighbor Agreement community meeting on June 17th. Will be open house format, focusing on participant expectations, program requirements, and safety. So it's been a big effort on the community's part to make sure that these issues are being addressed. And so if you live around there, I know a few of you in the room live around there, you are welcome to come and listen and participate as you see fit. Also, we do need a new Chabad, Housing Authority Board of Directors. Director, we are open. We're open to getting names, but really the position that is open is a resident or participant position. So they have to be either in the public housing or the Housing Choice Voucher program. So essentially being funded as sort of federal programs. And so we are working with our program staff to try to identify and recruit someone who will take that now vacant position. So more to come on that front, particularly for our co-chairs, of how we want to think about some interviews and so forth. And if you know of anyone who may be a participant yourselves or through your programs, contact Nadia. Nadia right there. Nadia will be the person to reach out to, because I think we're accepting them on a rolling basis. And then I just wanted to end my comments and updates with a story about Ahmed. Ahmed really, the story when he had to escape danger and he came to Washington County. He was a refugee, really rebuilt his life through community involvement and support through our housing programs. He he saw a pamphlet about rent assistance, and that really began his path to stability through the public housing program. And now, years and years later, through our Section 18 disposition initiative, he was able to purchase a home where his family began their life. So he's now the first homeowner in his family in the United States, and is now a big proponent of homeownership for future generations. So it's just full circle moments like this we wanted to just really share with you and remind us all of why we're here. So with that, I would be happy to open up for questions.
Not a question, but there's a comment from Paul and Zoom. Molly team, congratulations on the 9% award. That's awesome. Thank you also for the shout out.
Thank you for continuing your service on our committee, Mom.
Great. Well, with that, since there are no questions for Molly, we'll move on to Nadia for staff liaison update.
Yes, so as Molly said, we are recruiting for the Housing Authority Board of Directors. We still have some seats open on the Housing Advisory Committee. And so I will continue to email you more details about that. And if you have folks that you want to recommend, please let me know. Let's see.
The next is, if there's a chair update. Ryan, did you have anything that you wanted to share as an update? Co-chair?
No, thank you.
All right. I'm just flying through things. All right, so now we have Lisa Barron, Real Estate Division Manager, to give us an update on the Metro Affordable Housing Fund. Lisa, hi.
Good morning. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the Metro Affordable Housing Bond update. Next slide. So we are kind of at a relatively steady moment in the Metro Affordable Housing Bond process, where we have a couple of projects just getting started and one project under construction. So in regard to projects that are not HAWC sponsored, Woodland Park is under construction. I think they're more than 50% now. And as you can see in this picture, they've wrapped the building. It's looking pretty good. And then we recently started our Heartwood Phase 2 redesign. As you may recall, that project had a first phase where we prepared it for people to move in, but we didn't have the funds at the time to do building systems and the things that keep the building long-term. So this is a relatively small rehab. It's about a $3.5–4 million rehab, where we're pretty focused on the skin of the building, the windows, the plumbing, and then we are making some pretty significant changes to the lobby area, the offices, where the resident services and case management staff work based on their feedback that they've given us, and things that could be better for them and for the residents in terms of privacy and the ability to have one-on-one meetings, the ability to have a break room for the staff, things like that. So that's going to be pretty significant when you come in. Aloha 209 has achieved 100% design development, and we've also completed our impact assessment application at OHCS, which is the second phase of the kind of tripart OHCS application. We're applying for a 4% tax credits and gap funding lift. And then Forest Grove PSH, you just got the update. We're wrapping up our general contractor RFP, which probably in the next couple of weeks we'll be able to say who the general contractor is going to be on that project. We're also putting out an RFP for development consultant or development partner, those are the main projects that are left. So we're at the tail end here of our Metro program in terms of production. Next slide. So you'll see here, this slide offers a geographic location of the projects. And then as you can see, the green projects are completed. Linebeck Gardens being the one that most recently completed construction. The Woodland Hearth is in yellow, and then we get to be in red with 209th and Forest Grove. Heartwood is sort of a hybrid because it had a first phase, so it's in green, but it's also technically in red. And as Molly said, we've exceeded 1,000 units for the affordable housing bond, which is really pretty amazing in a 5-year period for the region. On this slide, you can see just where we met certain targets around family, deeply affordable and permanent supportive housing. So we're doing pretty good in terms of those goals. We're almost at the family size completed. But when we're done, we will have exceeded all of those goals by some pretty significant measures. As you can see, like the deeply affordable, the target was 334, but the total unit estimate that we're gonna have is 413. So we have some pretty significant ways in which, in particular with permanent supportive housing, in which we've exceeded the production targets that we set at the beginning of the program. Next slide. Okay, that's it, short and sweet.
I had a question, Lisa, about the Heartwood. That's the second, there's been a couple of rehabs of that, right?
That's
Is this the last phase, that the feeling now that it's,
We hope, yeah, we hope. I mean, as you can imagine, we've had some challenges with the population there. We had a fire, a year and a half ago that we're still repairing units from, so, you know, barring any major issues happening to the building.
right,
This should be the end of it.
okay.
Can you remind us, I'm sorry,
Go
John,
ahead, go ahead.
are the targets that are identified in that last slide, are those targets? Who set those targets, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I believe they were set by Metro initially.
That was an agreement with Metro.
Okay.
Those are under the local implementation plans.
Mhm.
And each of the local jurisdictions agrees to specific metrics. And those were the metrics we agreed to.
Mhm.
Granted, those metrics were also based on the original allocation of the funds we received, not any of the additional monies. For
Okay.
example, we had some interest earnings and all those.
Okay,
And that's where the Metro Affordable Housing Bond for PSH is coming to,
okay,
for example, for the Forest Grove.
okay, thank you.
So I'm sort of curious around, so it looks like, Washington County Housing Authority's done a great job in using their allocations and beating targets. So, there's some noise, I think, around some other people using these bonds in the greater community. But so what's your sense around communications of, is there any talk of Metro, like in a year or two or three, of floating more bonds? I think right now politically it might be tough in certain electoral communities to get, but I'm just curious, is there talk about that already, about what are we gonna do in the future?
So there was chatter, Metro counselors and some of the, other jurisdictions a couple of years ago. Understanding that most of the bonds were actually committed, even though we knew it was gonna take still a few more years for it to be expended. Since then, public opinion has really soured on any new tax measure, and so the challenge with the bonds is that it's a 20-year bond to our property tax. Even though the funds are gonna all probably be spent out in about 9 years.
Right.
And so if we pass another bond, it's a add-on bond to your property tax bill.
Right.
So that led Metro Council to believe this is not the time to pass another tax measure. So there was chatter about a year or two ago, could we look at supportive housing services measure to potentially help with some of the, or help with affordable housing, or at least with permanent supportive housing. And that, with the challenge of that, of course, was SHS was still early phase and everyone was still building out the system. And so you couldn't get agreement of what portion could get carved off into affordable housing. So I think Metro right now is having to first figure out the SHS renewal before they can really figure out a bond referral. So we're still probably a few years out. And SHS sunsets in 2030.
So does Metro have the ability? Probably not. Probably anything they float has to be for three counties, right? In it, there's no way that one could go to them and say, "Can you float them just for our county?"
Then they would both ask a question, why can't you just do that yourself?
Right. Okay, but then you have a limit on how much you can float yourself, don't you? Is there a limit on how much you can float? Maybe no. Maybe that's private nonprofits. Maybe the housing authority can float as much as they want. Okay, I'm confusing.
Well, like City of Portland, they passed their own bond.
Right, okay, right, so cities can't, I'm sorry, I'm thinking maybe nonprofits have limits on how much they're allowed to
But
float.
but you'd still have to have a tax to back the bond.
Right, no, I understand you have to
So
I'm
you
just
still have
talking
to
about
issue
if,
shares,
you know, if you get caught up in the greater thing where you can't pass it. But you might think you can do it within your own
Right.
geography.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about options if you feel you
Well-
have the support.
Well, worked long enough in Washington County, before the metro, there was talk in Washington County of a Washington County bond. For housing, and it was framed around three things: workforce, early learning, and housing, affordable housing. There was this idea for a levy. Metro just swamped all that with the Metro bond, I remember working in Washington County, people who worked in housing were shocked that, because Washington County was seen as a very conservative, anti-tax county, it passed in Washington County in 2018. And I had just started at Finistar, and that was like kind of shocking to the local, like Val Valfrey and stuff, who was one of Molly's predecessors, we're like, oh, it passed in Washington County. So anyway,
Okay, I guess this is more just,
Yeah.
sort of an interesting discussion.
yeah,
I think it should be a future conversation of this, group.
Right.
Whether that, anyway, we do have I will say a local historian on the call, but that could be, I don't wanna go too far into that. But Jess is a resource eventually
sure.
on that.
But don't you think politically the SHS measure is just gonna suck all the air out of the room for a couple of years? No, Jeff doesn't think so, okay. What happened with the SU?
I mean, I just bring it up because based on this data or
Pretty good,
information,
it's pretty good,
we have a very good story.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's true.
Bruce.
A very Yeah, just a very simple question. Remind me of the AMI for each one of the projects listed. Is the same calculation or does it vary project to project?
All the projects are 60% AMI and below because they're all tax credit projects, although some of them may have done income averaging, meaning that they might have some units in those projects that are at 80% AMI, but that means that they probably then have more in the 30% AMI.
Got it. Okay, yeah, thanks. Thanks for the clarification.
Bruce, many of them will have also 30% AMI units and below, because we also have vouchers in those, as well as permanent supportive housing. So they're not all regulated at 60% area median income. Many of them will have other levels.
Perfect. Thank you.
Jess, your hand is raised?
I'll be brief because I sense that the conversation Lisa wants to move on with the presentation, but you said ballot measure, which is my favorite word, so I couldn't help it. Nathan, to your question, my experience in the ballot measure work I've been able to do so far is that it's really about momentum and how are we building momentum through the supportive housing services measure to get ready for what else is needed to support our housing goals as a region. And many of you were there when we were building momentum with the Portland Housing Bond, and just 2 years later, that led to a regional housing bond. So I understand that there's a lot of heaviness around the supportive housing services measure right now and the weight of renewing it, but that can also be an opportunity if we are strategic and work together as a region. So I'll leave it off there.
Yeah, I just want to say is, many of you know, I came from Southern California 2 years ago, and it really is pretty incredible to think about what the last 5 years have been for Washington County and the amount of an entire system being built out, basically from soup to nuts, and including the affordable housing that was produced. I think it is a really incredible story to tell. And we have some other narrative areas where we get stuck or things get completed with Portland proper that we're gonna have to figure out where we live with that information.
Everyone's had their hand raised has been addressed. So I think we'll move on. Thank you, Lisa. We now have Jill Chen, Deputy Director, Ryan, how do you say your last name?
Bonsbach.
Bonsbach, thank you, Deputy Chief Financial Officer. and Steve Netter, budget manager, to share an update on the fiscal year 26-27 budget and the proposed budget policy with us. Today, we're gonna be asked to vote on submitting both the budget and the budget policy to Abad after this presentation, so we'll be ready for a vote for that. So without further ado,
Thank you.
thanks, Joan.
There. And for the record, I'm Joe Chen, Deputy Director. I'll let my colleagues introduce them when they're speaking. And just a quick overview of our discussion today is about the Housing Authority, a little bit more also about how we intersect with the Department of Housing Services, because we're shared, you can call it. The staffing is all shared. And then a quick budget overview, a little discussion about each of the programs, and then the budget in each of the programs. The vouchers will only, because we're a housing authority, the vouchers will only be discussing the federal vouchers. And then we'll talk about the public housing, as well as our development and housing operations and the budget policy and the requested actions, as Haley mentioned. Next slide, please. As Haley mentioned, we have two separate actions that we will be asking you all to vote on. One is the resolution to adopt the budget on June 16th with our Housing Authority Board of Directors. And the next is also to adopt the budget policy effective to the beginning of next fiscal year. Next slide, please. A quick overview about our whole department, and these numbers are from our last fiscal year, and this is for the whole department. You'll see that we served over 20,000 people. This is equivalent of the size of Sherwood itself as a whole city. So it's I think quite impressive. Also the other one, because I'm a capital person, I love the 26 capital projects. Molly mentioned the 13 that's still ongoing. It is just, it's a lot of work, and we want to thank you all for your support. So other highlighted items is the number of people, the number of households that we are serving in our rental assistance, both long and short term, long-term and short-term. This is for all of our programs, not only the HUD programs, but also the state and the regional programs from Metro. Last but not least, is a total number of affordable housing that we own and maintain is over 1,100. Next slide, please.
Hey.
Pass it over to Ryan.
Good morning, everyone. Ryan Bonsbach. I got that last name from my husband, so I take no responsibility. It's awkward pronunciations. Y'all have seen this slide before, but we continue to show this to different groups to kind of talk about the differences in the interplay of the Department of Housing Services and the Housing Authority Board of Directors. And the Housing Authority of Washington County, overseen by the Chabad. So we're only talking about the Housing Authority today and the Housing Authority's budget. The Department of Housing Services budget is passed and developed through the county's process, but there is a lot of transfers of funds between the two entities. So every employee of the Housing Authority of Washington County is technically employed by the Department of Housing Services and is reimbursed with funding from the Housing Authority. We also have a lot of funds that are initially appropriated to the Department of Housing Services that are transferred over and executed through the Housing Authority. So some of those include the Supportive Housing Services funds for the Cornell Road Recovery Center and the Affordable Housing Bond funds that we just talked about. One other quick note here, for anyone who's going to add these numbers up and say that it doesn't match our proposed budget, I'll just say that these numbers include our fund balance. There's been some attention lately to talking about fund balances in the context of annual budget. So we're also making sure that we will be speaking to and sharing what our fund balance is throughout our budgeting process and with our board of directors. Housing authorities and other entities often are not spending all of their money in a given year. In fact, they shouldn't be. So you're always carrying a fund balance. And so we want to clarify what our annual operating budget's going to be versus what our ongoing fund balance is. Next slide. So this is just a brief org chart that goes kind of one level down from what you saw earlier. So we're talking about kind of three different major program areas: federal vouchers, public housing, and then real estate development and operations. And then these are kind of subcategories beneath that. Let's go to the next slide. And then, so here we'll actually get into what our proposed budget is. I'm gonna turn back to Jill to talk about some of our strategies for this year.
Just a quick overview about our sort of strategy. You'll see that what we're doing is really trying to make sure that we are sustainably operating by right sizing our operations, looking at our administrative costs and improving our cash flows. And this sort of goes through all of the programs that you will hear and see in terms of how we're going to be looking at our budgeting. You'll also see that what we talked about earlier about the 26 projects and the 13 that's ongoing and the Forest Grove is really this integration between housing and homeless services, and that focus on that integration and how we can support our community in that spectrum of housing and homelessness to housing, right? And last, I've mentioned, is this structural sustainability, wanting to ensure that we are really moving towards sustainability on an ongoing long-term basis, especially given the uncertainty as to what is happening with the federal government. Pass it back to Ryan.
Next slide. So a few of the budget highlights this year, as you'll see in one of the slides later in this presentation, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is the vast majority of the annual funding for the Housing Authority. So we're always paying attention to what indicators we're getting around what those revenues will look like. What we're anticipating currently is that the Housing Choice Voucher, so the actual housing assistance payments or HAP, are likely to increase in the next year, but that the administrative portion may decrease. And obviously the administration portion covers our overhead and the cost of actually administering and running those programs. So we're paying close attention to that. It also kind of anchors back to what Jill said around looking at kind of optimizing our operations to make sure that we can continue to administer all of that housing assistance. We are expecting to generate over 8 million in Section 18 disposition funds, which will continue to increase what our reserves are to support our current development projects as well as future development projects along our pipeline. And the last thing is that our total net position in the next year is continued to increase slightly with those Section 18 dispositions, developer fees, and water bill payments. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is an overview of our revenue and expenditures. So 83 million plus a little bit in revenue, 82 million in expenditures. You can see it broken out program by program. The bottom line is that we are slightly above break even, looking at the total net of 800,000. If you back out depreciation expenses, then our actual cash flow is a positive 3.5 million. Getting back to talking about increasing those reserves with the Section 18 program. You will notice in a few of these categories, we are running small operating deficits. So thinking specifically, you can see that the voucher program is running a slight annual deficit, similar to the public housing program. These programs also have modest reserves. And so we are tapping into our reserves and have kind of guide points of where we'd like those reserves to land, which is why, again, Jill mentioned that we're going to be looking at our operations for all of these to make sure that we get to that break even point and that we will hold our reserves to make sure that we are carrying at least 3 months of operating expenses.
Ryan, can you hit on the also those strategy question around reserves with HUD?
Yeah, it's so the idea of having a 3-month reserve is having enough that we can navigate a little bit of uncertainty, but there's also a risk in carrying reserves in these federal programs like public housing, like federal vouchers that would be so high that HUD would potentially claw back that money. So there's always a little bit of a game, maybe not a game is the right word, but there's some strategy, and depending on what signals we're getting from HUD about what level of reserves that we'd be comfortable carrying. Right now, there's a big emphasis on cash management with this administration and really wanting housing authorities to not be carrying significant reserves. So here we get into a little bit of the fund balance that we talked about to show kind of what our beginning fund balance is, plus the anticipated revenues for this upcoming fiscal year, and then the kind of the expenditures by major cost categories. So you can see that broken out. We have right now about 20 million in unrestricted reserves. 30 million of that is in our net position of our capital assets. So we are again anticipating a net gain of about 800,000 that you can see in the start from that beginning fund balance on the far left-hand side to the end fund balance on the far right-hand side. Again, that number does include depreciation of those investment of capital assets, but you can see by major cost category where the expenditures are going. And then I'll also note that 12.4 million that you see that says transfer to local housing fund. Those are essentially investments in different projects that are ongoing, like Cornell Road or Heartwood, with most of the sources of those being from Metro funds, either the Affordable Housing Bond or SHS. Again, we just keep trying to clarify what the source is because it gets confusing that they are technically DHS funds. They're transferred and included in the housing authority's budget and then invested into these projects. So this slide represents the sources of our funding. So I said earlier, the vast majority is in the federal voucher program, which you can see the largest piece on this pie. The next line is for the federal grants and public housing subsidies. That's about 2 million. And that is a subsidy in addition to tenant rents from public housing that are used to operate and maintain that. We do see as we dispose of the single family homes through the Section 18 program that at some point HUD will start to wind down what our subsidy looks like based on our housing stock, but there is a little bit of a lag and a temporary increase, not increase, but there's a glide path that's provided based on the Section 18 program as you wind down your housing stock in traditional public housing. The next two things I'll highlight, if we could go back to the previous slide. So there are two lines here that are transfers from Metro funds. One is the Affordable Housing Bond for 4 million. One is a transfer of SHS for 3 million. So just from the Metro programs alone, that's 7 million in revenue. And again, most housing authorities are somewhere well north of 90% in what is federal funding that makes up their operations. Again, we are a little bit uniquely positioned to also have access to these local funding sources that help us accomplish our mission. And then sale of property for the Section 18 homes, anticipating 9.4 million in the actual sale of properties from the rest of that Section 18 program.
Glenn, can I have a quick question? That 58.5 million there, is that all just pass-through money, or does that include your like staffing?
This includes staffing, and it also includes what we call portability. So people who have ported in from other housing authorities. So we receive reimbursements from those housing authorities.
Another county or whatever.
And it's a wash, it nets out, but it is money in and out.
Do you have a ballpark of the percent that's for staffing? For they might call it admin.
We will, and I think the future slide, when we get into the program specifics, we will break it out into that salary level. You can see that. Let's go to the next slide. So a little timeline of staffing. The blue portion of the stacked bar is housing authority funded employees. The tan line is Department of Housing Services. I do want to be clear that, again, everyone is technically an employee of the Department of Housing Services, so a county employee. So this is really looking at how we are funding the staff that we have. So what you can really see here is with the implementation, especially of the SHS, Supportive Housing Services measure, you can see the increase in staffing primarily driven by that program and that new work that we were taking on. The Housing Authority staffing levels have been relatively stable during this same period. And so we will continue to kind of look at optimizing our organization going forward, but relatively stable throughout recent history. And now we will get into some of the specific program priorities and individual budgets. So I'll pass it over to Joe. Oh, Joe's.
Just wait, do you want us to wait to the very end, or I have a question on this section, so should I ask it now?
Oh, ask it.
Okay, so when this looks financially, fiscally good. But two, my question is sort of short-term versus long-term. So you're generating a positive revenue stream, but 9 million of that is due to sales. So that's great. I mean, positive from that. But what do you are you thinking out 2, 3, 4 years when you don't have things to sell anymore? And so I'm just saying, we look good today, but you got to look a little bit out like, am I setting myself up for a cliff in 3 or 4 years the way I've structured myself? So I'm just, you have this 9 million coming out of sales, which at some point is going to stop for you or diminish. So I'm just wondering, the question is, looks great, but I'm saying, are you thinking about that?
Yeah,
Yes.
and I should probably answer that one, John, and that's a great question about long-term and short-term. And the,
Or
you know,
midterm,
the
whatever.
rationale of why we're doing even the sale of our public housing stock. Because that was actually not a sustainable portfolio to manage, because it's mostly single-family
Right.
homes or small plexes, duplex quads, 6 plexes, they're just very small and inefficient to manage. So the longer term is, as we get the monies from our dispo, we're looking to use that because it's a HUD requirement that we can only use it for development of affordable housing by the Housing Authority.
Okay.
So we have to use that in order to go into the next development and look at our whole portfolio in terms of what sites we still have, which may be existing public housing stock, which we may, you can call it, reformulate into a multifamily. And that's part of that real estate strategy that Lisa and I are embarking on. Right now, we've got a few too many capital projects, but we're hoping towards the end of this calendar year, we'll start doing that and looking at what else are we going to be doing? Because the 9 million plus all that dispo money, the only thing we can do with it is what is allowed by HUD, which is more affordable.
So, I guess my corollary to this is, and I talked about this with you before, I support you doing your own development now. This one you get your own 9% credits on, which one creates certain risks for you didn't have before, but also creates other opportunities for you, right? So is that part of the strategy there, is to start developing on our own and take this 9 million and use it to help develop our own projects and start earning developer fees for ourselves instead of getting them to turnkey people? And is that part of the strategy?
That is one of the things we are going to be looking at. As you know, we are in the process, and Lisa has been building up the team. Not only on the development side, but also on the asset management side. So our public housing portfolio is going to be, you can call it restructured. As is also our other properties. We have a number of properties that need to be redeveloped, restructured. So the 9% may be the first. We are looking at what is the most optimal way we can potentially collaborate with others too. So we're not looking at it necessarily as solo is the only way, but it may be one of the ways.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Lisa, do you want to?
Oh, yeah, I would say, we inherited a pipeline, kind of a crazy pipeline, but we inherited a pipeline. Which had a vision for real estate development, but not the infrastructure to manage, to create that, to do that development, or to manage it once it became tax credit housing. So we spent the last 2.5 years since Jill got here, really kind of getting that infrastructure in place. So we will be development ready
And we do see that as part of our strategy, but I think we're also understanding that we have a role as a steward of housing throughout the entire region, throughout the county. And how do we find a balance between our role as that overall steward and our role as a developer on our own? And that's the discussion that we'll probably be bringing back to you in the next year or so, and the follow-up on the real estate strategy.
Thank you.
Bruce?
A couple part question, going down the same path. Do we know how much gross revenue as a percent or dollars is developer fee, as a line item? Do we know that? I didn't see it specifically.
It's not a specific line item because it is also very unpredictable. I mean,
Is there a future slide on it though?
there is a slide on it later about our development. If that's okay, we can address that.
Yeah, I was just trying to get, is it kind of down the same path? Is it 5% of our total revenue stream or 10% was my first piece? So when we get to that, great. And then,
Okay.
the run-on question is, do we get a lot of noise on the developer fee amount from developers? Does everybody think it's the greatest deal in the free world or that we charge too much? Any noise around that?
Or do I address?
Actually, the developer fee is capped both by Metro and by OHCS, and capped at levels that, you know, if you sat down and kind of figured out how much it cost you and the resources that it cost you to get that project done over the years, probably just about covers your costs. So, it's, what is it? Is it 3 or 4 million for Metro?
For Metro, actually right now on a deal that is not PSH, and it is straight affordable housing, is capped at 3 million cash.
Not
Developer fee,
deferred, yeah.
not deferred, right? Deferred is always through cash flow. So there is that. For OHCS is based on a number of units as well as the type of, you can call it, I think, production, so to say, because it's a difference between new construction versus preservation.
Got it.
So,
Well, and I was going down the path that maybe John talked about, being creative, thinking outside the box in the future, which is if you lowered your fees and you created more development, that could be a win. Can you do that? I mean, kind of investigating that delta between increasing fees because you're just trying to cover costs and you can only increase so much. And at some point, if it costs too much, it thwarts development, right? So I was just trying to get some sense of what that balance was like.
yeah, and that's a great question. And also one of the things we're looking at, which is trying to smooth out some of that development because the fees are quite lumpy.
Right.
So it's in one fiscal year and we have an OHCS event, which they delay us by 6 months or 12 months. It just sort of slides around. So our goal is to have more, we call secure, regular cash flow from operations and from other, you can call it fees. Be they cash
And
flow.
that's kind of where I was going. At times liquidity is king. So thank you. I won't take us too far offline, but that was just kind of my thought on a go forward basis. Thanks, all done.
Paul, your hands raised?
Yeah, thank you. So now this slides up. So sorry, Ryan. So just to follow up, I guess maybe on John's question, because when I looked at the revenue versus expenses, the differential is quite small. So if you take, when Joe, you're presenting that the 9.4 million from sales is limited on how that revenue can be used, but then it looks like it matches up with the total proposed expenses. Is that really, how much of that 9.4 is being held and not spent in the 26-27 budget cycle?
4 or 5. We will have an actual slide on that, but I think that we have about 3.4 million of that going into Wood Springs and about 1 million of that is used to recoup to the public housing program, the costs of actually preparing the homes for sale. So Jill talked about the uses of section 18 being limited to affordable housing development. The other item that you can pay for is the actual cost of going through the section 18 disposition. So the costs of doing rehabs on the homes to make them sellable, the other costs associated with selling them. And so we partially use the revenue there to offset that amount in the public housing program. 3 million will be spent on the Wood Springs project in the next fiscal year.
5.4 will be spent.
5.4
remaining.
3 remaining from this year's revenue for future years.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And Paul, that we will be going through that in a few more slides later.
Okay, and then just one other quick question. So the 3-month reserve that was discussed, if that's how the reserve, you end up sizing it, is that 3 months of the total revenue budget, or is it 3 months of a subset?
It would be 3 months of operating expenses. And so for the voucher program specifically, what we're thinking of is retaining the admin fee that we would need to administer the housing assistance payments for a 3-month period, should no new revenue come in. During the previous federal government shutdowns, HUD has had enough to continue to fund that admin portion. But a 3-month reserve is trying to strike that balance between having enough liquidity if we had to operate and there was a delay in payments, and not having so much that eventually that becomes attractive to HUD.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I think at this point, I'm gonna pass it back to Jill to talk a little bit about some of our specific programs.
Okay, great. Thanks. Next slide, please. So the first program we'll just talk about is the federal vouchers. And this is the information from last calendar year. We pushed in our federal programs that totaled in terms of our payments of about 55 million. The other numbers that you saw earlier that had the 58 some million, that delta was our administrative fees. That's what to cover our own operations with the occupancy specialists, the front desk, the folks who manage our landlord relationships as well as our participant relationships. Altogether, we have over 3,000 households using our federal vouchers. And this is, I hate to say, it's sort of the alphabet soup where you have all these names like BASH, EHV, FYI, Section 8. These are all of the different programs that Liz Morris and her team manage. And you'll see where the bulk of this is really under Section 8. This is not only our housing choice vouchers, meaning tenant-based, but it is also our project-based vouchers. We've got veterans as well, and that is Veterans Administration for Supportive Housing. Mainstream EHV is emergency housing vouchers. That is being wound down by the end of this calendar year. And our 47 foster youth initiatives. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it over to Steve.
My turn. For the record, Steve Netter, Budget Manager. So Ryan talked a little bit about these at high level, but here's some detail of the federal vouchers. So as he mentioned, we're running a small deficit of about $200,000. The question about kind of ins and outs, there's a lot of, what comes in goes out. So half payments, what comes in goes out, poured in and poured out, sort of matches up as well. And there's a question about the administrative fee. So you can see at the top on the left of 3.8 million, which goes to cover almost dollar for dollar the payroll and overhead that we have. So what's putting us into a small deficit here is a small amount of materials and services, which would be like software licenses, professional services, and contracted services, which is at a pretty, nominal amount. But it does put us a little bit over. And so, as we look at our operations going forward, we'll see how we can continue to get this closer to break even. But for the most part, what's coming in here is going straight out, to participants or to our staff.
The next is about our public housing portfolio. This is where our Section 18 disposition we were talking about. It was originally what the composition of the current, called public housing. We have 27 remaining single-family homes for sale. So by the end of this calendar year, we're expected to sell all 27. The remaining is the 132 small plex multifamily homes and the 52 other single family homes. We are in that process of looking at how we are going to be, you can call it, optimizing those 184 units. Because we also know that HUD is no longer going to be providing as much capital funds or as much operating funds. So using our Section 18 dispo and whatever reserves we have, what is the right, do we dispose more? Do we redevelop? That sort of strategic thinking is on that 184. On the right side of that with the little key, those are our specialty housing projects. Half of that was also sold, and that is also part of our corpus now. So, yes.
Jill, do you know why the 52 homes weren't sold in the current round?
I don't.
The other single family?
The original 60 units that were sold when we originally proposed to HUD, I think that was almost 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
It was
yeah.
a long time ago.
And they weren't included, but you're not sure why.
We
Yeah,
don't know
okay.
why. And frankly, to be honest, when I went back and looked at the 60 units to see why they were the 60, I'm also trying to figure out why it was. And
Like how they were selected or whatever, yeah.
we just don't have very good files of those.
Okay.
So whatever process we have though, for another disposition or whatever process we have, we know we should probably start it sooner than later because it will take time.
He was already starting to take a look. It takes at least a year to put together your application to HUD.
Yeah.
So, it's a pretty long runway.
Yeah.
And I hand it back over to Steve for the numbers.
Thanks, Jill. All right, next slide. Okay, so public housing, when you back out depreciation, we have a break-even net cash flow. A lot of the things on here that we see are from, the prior slides, the revenue and the waterfall chart, but we're getting a little bit of money in from federal capital grants, from public housing subsidies, a little bit of rental income, and then this is that first million that we're spending from the Section 18 dispo. So this is the reimbursement of repair and maintenance to get those properties ready for sale. And then on the expenditure side, again, we're paying for our payroll and overhead, a small amount of materials and services. You can see that repair and maintenance there, that Section 18 goes toward helping reimburse, and a little bit of depreciation. So overall message is we're break even here on cash flow.
The next one is our affordable housing projects. I should mention the slides you saw earlier about all the monies for our affordable housing projects. Those do not include any of our partnerships, which is most of actually our housing stock. Like Woodspring, our AHP4 or phase 2, is not included in these budget numbers because those are essentially discrete component units, and we are just the general partner. We are actually not the majority owner. So you'll see that we have large multifamily projects on the side. Those are all the limited partnerships. We are going to be probably increasing those because what you heard today was we're going to have a Forest Grove 9%. So that's going to be another limited partner. We also have already, I think, set up the lower 209 LP. It's just not yet funded. So there'll be 2 additional ones as we move along. And then there's a small plexus. These are not our public housing also. These are the ones we're also contemplating. How do we optimize those sites? And, how do we manage those? Those are small sites. And then the permanent supportive and transitional housing, you'll see the items in blue. Those are the projects that are funded by the Supportive Housing Services measure and really in collaboration with our homeless services team. The land was purchased and working with some monies from Metro as well as a Care Oregon grant. And then you have the Central County Safe Rest Village pod, and that's also owned by Hawk. Next slide, please. as Lisa mentioned, we have a timeline and a development budget. Some of this is shifting even as we speak because of different activities with funding timelines with Oregon Housing, but you'll see that in fiscal year 25-26, the activities that the real estate affordable housing team, did, and it still sort of flows into the next fiscal year. So you'll see that we have the Cornell, the Central County, the Pod Village opening sometime in, I believe we're targeted towards, I think it's October or end of summer. And then Cornell Road is sometime early fall. And then Wood Spring construction completion targeting early 2027. I'm not sure about Aloha 209 start of construction because we're still in negotiations and discussions as to when we're gonna get funding for that one. Forest Grove PSH, that one, because we have been notified of the funding availability, we're probably gonna be moving that one forward because that is a fast speed 9%. And of course, you were also heard about the Hardwood Phase 2. Next slide, and Steve will go through the numbers today.
All right, so for here, we've broken out operations development to 2 different slides to make it a little more transparent. For housing operations, we are cash flow positive by about $2 million. On the revenue side, there's 2 major components that make up that 4.3 million. We get about 2.3 million from the Katama property, which is a key generator of cash for us, those are waterfall payments. And then back to the question about developer fees earlier, the remaining 2 million is developer fees and partnership fees. And so that's the totality of what we have in this budget for those types of activities. On the expenditure side, majority of it is payroll and overhead. And again, a little bit of material and services and depreciation on top of that. But overall, good cash flow coming in from an operations standpoint. And next slide. Development's also cash flow positive of 1.6 million when you back out depreciation. This is where the majority of our depreciation is. So you see that 2.3 million on the top right. And again, this is where we see some of what the money is coming in, going out for different projects. So the other 8.4 of that 9.4 million in sales from Section 18 is on the revenue side here. 5.4 of that's going to fund the Wood Spring construction. The other 3, as we mentioned, will remain or go into our fund balance for future years. We do get 4 million from the Metro Affordable Housing Bond, which will go to fund Heartwood, and we're getting 3 million from SHS, which will go to fund the Cornell Road project. We do have a little bit of rental income that comes in here as well, which helps to fund some of our payroll and overhead, repairs and maintenance, and material and services. Although it doesn't cover all of it completely. So again, the total net is a little bit negative, but when you back out depreciation, we're cash flow positive by about $1.5 million.
So housing operations is positive due to some property that throws you waterfalls, but I guess the reality is either you lose that, I don't know when they stop, it's a break-even operation when that stops flowing in.
That would be correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know when that was.
A Kapama there's no termination date on it.
Oh, there's not.
We're one of the partners. We're 50%.
special limited partner.
So you get this much, you expect these waterfalls to be, it's not like a drop dead date.
No, there's no drop dead date,
great.
like before developer fees when it expires.
Okay, all right, thank
We're
you.
50% partner.
Okay, thanks.
Good place to pause. Any other questions on any of the numbers?
I guess I don't have a question so much as question about the numbers, because I'm not a numbers person, like the rest of my very educated committee members, but and maybe this is a question I have because you guys are so sound budgetarily, and this is a very convincing presentation, but a lot of where my brain wants to go and ask is, it's really great to see 26 and 27, but like where things are going. But similar to John's really astute question before about the funding sources and from a Metro standpoint and everything. Talking about that, I don't think it's for the presentation you're making, but that's something I would love to really spend more time on is like what's beyond that little arrow for you guys, would be really something I think this committee could be.
What I'm hearing you say, Haley, is
Mhm.
that you'd like us to really present maybe more of a 5-year outlook. That
That's a-
looks at our
yes, thank you,
pipeline, looks at our real estate strategy, makes some
Yeah.
assumptions.
Yeah.
Plug in some potential timing of developer fee infusions.
Mhm.
Some assumptions of when we think the section 18 sales proceeds would be redeployed.
Mhm.
And start plotting that out, so not just a production plan, but a cash flow. That drives that production plan, is that what I'm
I think that's
hearing?
a much better way of putting it than I did, and I feel like it's very. You have a committee here that can really give you great feedback on that sort of 5-year lookout in a way that maybe is more impactful, just based upon the makeup of this committee. So
Great, and so that will be good for us in our work plan for the year, thinking about when, because that's a lot of work anyway, a lot
Sure.
of assumptions.
Yeah.
But we will take that into account for future meetings.
And I think, I just want, I just wanna make sure. What we have here is also just the production.
Right.
Pipeline. There's also other things that we would like to be bringing forward about policies or framework. Because as we talked about this spectrum of housing and homeless services, where do we all see the gaps? We would like to be able to encapsulate that also as part of our real estate strategy and have that discussion with you about where else can we or should we even be venturing into? And we would like to bring that proposal, some of those proposals to this committee. Sorry, Nathan, I think Nina first.
So I had a question kind of on the same thing with ongoing revenue. So for the housing that's being disposed, was there funding for that housing that now, since it's disposed, will go away? And then how does that all work out long term?
Yep. Our subsidies from HUD do decrease as our public housing stock decreases, but also our operations and the amount of deferred maintenance that we need to address also decreases. And I think what Jill was getting at especially is that single family homes are particularly difficult to maintain when we're trying to house the maximum number of people. So we'll continue looking at how we house the most number of people, but it likely won't be single family homes. It will be larger multiplexes, or it will be through development of affordable housing.
And just for your information, most of our public housing portfolio was created in the 1980s. And many of it have huge deferred maintenance. So as we sold our, or as we're selling our 60, we found that we have had to put in thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. Because we really can't rehab some of these units. Especially not the interior when the folks are living in there. So many of our stock that is in the public housing, even though HUD gives us capital funds, it's actually not enough necessarily to keep that maintenance going because it needs such a huge amount.
So I'll just add, we all have different levels of expertise, like I can't draw, so but
compliment each other very nice.
I appreciate art, but I can't create it, how's that? But also, my background's finance, but numbers just can't drive us when we have a mission, right? So I mean, mission is probably the top of the heap, and then you have those other things that fall under it. And I think all we're saying is we want those to make sense and be successful, because you can't create your mission if these things aren't successful. I mean, it's sort of obvious, but I guess that's what we're all sort of talking about, right?
Yeah, Jill, when you were talking about the exploring different, I guess, options for housing where the gaps are, probably you're all aware that Oregon Community Foundation announced this $100 million middle housing fund that they're going to be creating. I'm trying to get a meeting with them to understand what it is. We have a few little niche projects where maybe that could fit for like 6 units of townhome ownership kind of thing. But is that something, is that within the scope of the mission, to go back to what John's saying, or is that? Cause then you're going up above potentially even 80% AMI
It-
households, right?
Maybe for home ownership,
Mhm.
because one of the things we're looking at is with our sale of our section 18, we were able to create some
Right.
wonderful home ownership opportunities, not necessarily for the folks who are in our buildings, but for other lower income folks, right?
Right.
So this is an opportunity where, Lisa and I have already been starting to talk about some of the multiplex. Do we use that for like condo conversion?
Right.
Bring in, say, a Proud Ground or Habitat and do
Right,
something
right.
different. So those might be some things,
Mhm.
or maybe in collaboration with OCF for the middle income.
Yeah.
Is that something possible? But for us to manage it directly is probably not something we would love for somebody else to be able to do that. Yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, I just wanna add, if you go back to the slides with all the housing, projects. Yeah, that one, yep, with the gray. The gray,
Slide.
yeah, so you'll see, no.
Keep going back.
Remember the insurance 20s.
Oh, I'm sorry, keep going forward. I'm getting confused on the slide. Keep going forward, go forward. That one.
Okay, so you'll see here that right now, HAWK is really taking on quite a few permanent supportive and transitional housing projects. Because we are trying to fill a gap.
Right.
In the county, but
Sure.
to John's point, if we want to be a long-lasting organization, we cannot always be the only one
Yeah.
filling that gap in county. And so that is part of the conversation
Yeah.
as well. But and to Jill's point is there's two ends of the spectrum and we want to be able to kind of figure out, not necessarily always be moving at one end or the other.
Right.
And not just on the spectrum, but also in terms of our role, right? Our role is also flexible. I mean, we've already invested in some, we've been general partners in some, we've been special limited partners in some, so it could be a range also.
It doesn't appear anyone has any questions online. Can I just make one more comment about something you said about home ownership? It's because I draw, I'm on the drawing side of home ownership. But it's not something we've been doing a lot of as architects, which means as architects are often the canary in the coal mine. I am eager to hear how the home ownership model is actually working. And if it's really leading to successful outcomes, not just for the homeowners, but also for the developers that are doing them. And so it seems very much like the hot topic at the moment, but I don't know how tried and true of a development opportunity is for you all, especially in the mission-driven conversation. And so I would just be eager for the committee as well as you all to really investigate the successful ventures of that homeownership model, since it does feel, homeownership is obviously not new, but like the idea of the Proud Ground approach to the land trust model and how successful has this been going?
That's a great idea. When Jill and I worked at the Portland Housing Bureau, we did a whole impact analysis, I'm trying to remember, anyway, the pros and cons of each of the models. And so, the challenge, of course, is here in Washington County, we don't have revenue streams dedicated just to homeownership. So I think having that model conversation is important in the concept of, is the legislature funding ideas, and whether OCF or Community Foundation is something that we could sort of deploy. And I think what I would like us to move to is framework, so that we can, like a term sheet-ish. So that you can kind of go as other people, if we are playing a role that makes sense, we have something that can be more easily executable for others to develop.
Okay,
Yeah, great. Yeah. The whole goal is to have the replicability of these programs, so it could be much more easier for our community, other developers, other homeowners. participants. Okay, nobody wants to do it one time and be done. It's like, that's not efficient.
Thank
Go forward. Sure. So, yeah, I mean, just to wrap up, next steps, so we'll continue to strengthen the integration of rural housing and homeless services that we see in this budget this year. Continue to strengthen that going forward. We continue to address the structural sustainability of policy. We've had some good discussion about that. From a financial standpoint, but also from an operations standpoint. And we'll continue to strategically manage our reserves and fund balances. And look at, various different diversification strategies around revenue to make sure that we're, tapping into the, the revenue streams that are available to us. So that's it for the budget presentation. If we move forward, just a couple of quick slides on the budget policy. And so, the budget policy emailed out to everyone. It's about a 4-page document that talks about how we want to approach budgeting within the housing authority. One of the things, particularly from a finance standpoint, is that we're trying to have more documented policies within the housing authority. I think it was an audit finding or item or suggestion in the past. And when I came here, I realized we don't have a budget policy. We do have a budget policy for the Department of Housing Services through the county finance. And so what we're trying to do is really largely aligned to that policy. As a blended component unit of the county, we don't want to go off and do something completely different. So the purpose of this is to address, our code of financial regulations requirement for public housing authority to have an approved budget and to have a structure around that, to be closely aligned with the county's established policy. And this policy has been reviewed and input incorporated from our county council and our county budget manager in the central finance organization to make sure that we're aligned. And the idea is that the adoption of this policy will improve our ability to maintain financial stewardship, compliance, transparency, and accountability when it comes to how we set our annual budget and how we're able to make adjustments to that budget throughout the year, which right now we're not able to make those adjustments without agency.
One quick piece of context, I think historically, because the housing authority is not subject to Oregon local budget law, the county viewed us as like, go off and do your own thing. So our budgets were not even in our financial system because they only manage the county's budget in the financial system, which means that we have a layer of internal controls that are missing. So we have now reached out and requested and have been added to the budget so that our reports will actually contain our budgets. So that anyone also in the central organization, our board of directors is 5 of our county commissioners. So we're doing everything that we can to increase transparency to that group and in our own internal controls to make sure that we are executing the budget that we established, or we are going through proper documented channels to modify that with the right level of public involvement. So back to you.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it. The next slide has a little bit of what I call high level detail. Can't put 4 pages of policy onto one slide, but the idea here is that the budget is to the policy is to strengthen integration between with the county through our policy alignments, as I mentioned, trying to be as aligned to their policies as we can and improve our budget visibility across not just the housing authority but with the county. This policy does establish sort of formal framework and structure of how we develop, manage, update, monitor our annual budget. It does have some clear guidelines, or what I hope are clear guidelines for how we project our revenue, how we project and estimate our expenditures, how we're going to manage our fund balance, and how we do that internal cost recovery for things like staffing with the Department of Housing Services, and really outline structured process. So that we know how the timelines, who gets involved, when we need to do things, how we go about creating that budget, approval thresholds for when we want to make adjustments, what can be approved sort of within the housing authority versus what needs to go to our board of directors, and sort of our ongoing responsibilities when it comes to reporting out our numbers and monitoring our performance. So a lot goes into to those pages in the document, but the key takeaway is we want to have structure, frameworks, processes all outlined that we plan to follow to make sure that while we're not beholden to local Oregon budget law, that we do have a document that says here's how we are going to approach budgeting going. Any questions?
Yeah, okay, so from a, I read this, I think it's really good, but I had a couple of questions, just for clarifications. So it's more about budget adjustments. So I just wanted to make sure, I'm just sort of speaking out loud, it says for itself, but so for 5 to 10%, it requires 2 approvals, right? I'm just looking for audit approval process. So it requires 2 people to sign off on that, the housing.
Yes.
And is that, do you need to say that needs to be in writing, or can that just be oral agreements? I mean, does it specifically say in here, you need a document that's signed by 2 people, or 2 people can just get in a room and say, do it and walk out?
The policy doesn't call that out, so the question.
I mean, I'm not saying you should necessarily, but I'm just saying from an audit standpoint.
Our intent would be to have it in writing, yes.
To have a memo that would be signed by the necessary people.
Okay.
Anything that goes to the Board of County Commissioners requires a resolution and ordinance, and so it would be similar.
All right, I could then call it out, but I'm just curious, because I think it's better in writing, and it also creates a history in 2 years from now, if someone wants to know how funds were moved, they can figure it out.
Yep.
Yes.
And then, so, okay, that was just in writing, dual, and the only one I have is here, which I think it's fine, but it gives you options on, as I know what you did in the past with me, so I'm not saying it's me, but I'm just saying you have 2 co-chairs now, but it says when you do take your budget to annual approval with the commissioners, because I would call them commissioners, I don't know. Director, excuse me, one of the 2 co-chairs will go with you, which is great. But do you want to say co-chairs or designee? In case somebody's not available.
All 3 opportunities for you.
It's a minor point, but you said one of them will definitely attend with you.
We have 2 now, right? So it helps.
But I'm just saying, it gives you options.
Yeah,
If someone's not comfortable doing it, it gives you options to pick somebody else on the committee.
great suggestion.
I love
I'm not trying to pitch myself.
No, I know.
I need to move on.
Co-chairs for John Epstein.
I don't think anyone will ever come back and say, documents say this, and you brought somebody else, but I mean, just as long as you have the option to get it right.
I like that as an answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we can amend it now, can't we? Like on the fly, like you suggested.
Yes.
Can we?
Yeah.
Can, oh, okay.
So I guess, are we trying to vote to approve this?
Right, because we're gonna vote on it.
So all I'm doing is making a motion that we add designee to budget process number 9.
Yep.
Okay.
Do both co-chairs have to agree on the designee? Not to- Agree that mine-
I mean, I guess they agree on whatever, but I'm just saying, it gives you options.
And in writing or?
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just.
We can vote to amend.
We can vote to amend
We can vote to
Right.
amend, yes.
the policy.
So when you vote, I guess I make a motion and you vote.
Ryan, were you trying to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to thank John. That was actually something we talked about yesterday in the prep for this meeting was, John, you do such a great job gearing the Chabad presentation, representing the work that's gone
Right.
into it in the committee. So
I'm not saying I want it, I'm just saying.
Yeah. One does leave.
You may not have a choice.
Okay,
Okay. So we need a motion to vote on this?
well, before, I think we're all, is there any other questions anyone has? So then, yes, Harry, would you like, while you're, co-chairing with me?
Co-chair.
So yes, now we will vote on the requested items. So with that, the first vote will be, the request before us is to approve the presentation of the HOF budget to the Housing Authority Board of Directors, Chabad, and request a board resolution to adopt the budget on June 16th. So this is for the budget, not for the budget policy. So with that, does anyone make a movement to adopt the budget
Do I second it?
first? So I need a first.
First, whatever, yes, I agree, approve.
I'll second that.
Paul was the second. Thank you very much. The motion has been moved and seconded. Is there any other further discussion? Do I have? Yeah. Okay, so we'll have a vote now on the motion to approve and send to the budget. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I
7-1. Sorry, my phone I'm in a weird spot.
Aye, and then all opposed say nay. Okay. I believe the motion has passed. So, I'm new at my duties. Done. Okay. I will check those off. So it was Bruce. Thank you. Okay. Ryan, Paul. Ethan. I just need to make sure I get the vote in. I'm sorry. John, myself. Dave is there, so thank you. All right. Then we move on to, we are now being asked to approve submitting the Hawk budget policy as presented to the Housing Authority Board of Directors and request board approval with an effective date of July 1st, 2026. I believe this is where we can add the amendment.
Yeah, so it can be as presented with the amendments that were discussed.
With amendments discussed. Okay. And the amendments that were discussed, John, was that with changing it so that it wasn't exclusive to co-chairs.
Right, okay, and adding designee. So just read hack co-chairs and then maybe, I think maybe in parentheses you put or designee.
Or designate.
Yeah.
Designee. Okay. With that, does anyone, the motion has been moved, excuse me. Does anyone move to pass the consent agenda? I need a first motion.
The consent agenda is the policy, right?
Yes.
Yes,
I move.
thank you, Nathan. Is there a second?
A second.
Thank you. With that, we will now vote on that motion to approve it. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. All right, the motion has passed. Thank you. Thank you for this. This is also very helpful. Okay. With that, we're gonna go on to new business, right? So thank you for that, you guys. Now we're gonna move on to Ann Nichols, the housing program coordinator, who has an update for us on the HUD required review of the Housing Authority's administrative plan and admissions and continued occupancy plan.
I need to scoot. Are we gonna have quorum if I have to leave?
We should still have quorum.
Okay, great. Okay, 'cause I need to go.
Sorry.
Didn't have to- okay.
I think, yeah. Today we are being asked to recommend sending the presented update to Chabad for approval after this review. So there will be one more vote today.
All right, good morning, committee members. It's nice to see you again. This will be a familiar routine we're getting into now with our semi-annual updates to our administrative plan governing the Housing Choice Voucher Program and the admissions and continued occupancies. Our goals today are making sure we inform you of our routine administrative updates to these documents and also getting your approval to bring them to the Housing Authority Board of Directors with your recommendation that they pass it on through. We will go over the PHA policies more generally. At this point, that's going to be old hat for y'all, but it's nice to get the refresher, and we'll have time for questions if there are any. Next, please. This slide is familiar to you, but as a refresher, the administrative plan and ACOP, the admissions and continued occupancy plans, support our Housing Authority annual plans. Those are the documents that I last brought to you. They describe Housing Authority procedures and operations, and we are currently on a semi-annual review period. HUD only requires an annual review period, but there has been a lot going on. So for the time being, semi-annual is the cadence that we are sticking with. They do require a public comment period, which will be ending June 1st. They sometimes do require a public hearing. This year, this cycle, we have routine updates. They do not require a public hearing, just that public comment period. The admin plan covers our HUD-funded voucher programs and serves as a reference for our continuum of care program administration and our regional long-term rental assistance program administration. Our admissions and continued occupancy plan does similar work for our public housing
program with the additional information that because in our public housing program, we are the owners and operators of rental housing. Those documents also establish our leasing and occupancy policies. So they have a slightly different responsibility. Next slide. As I said, these documents have a 45-day public comment period required by HUD, and this is ongoing. Began on April 16th and will end on June 1st. Both the Resident Advisory Board and the Housing Advisory Committee get informational sessions on our changes, and they will go to the Housing Authority Board of Directors for approval. They have been moved to the June 16th consent agenda. Because these documents are aligned with our annual plan, they can stay on the consent agenda for the Housing Authority Board of Directors. I'll note about this policy cycle, this is the first one we've been through where we also have a fully up and running policy implementation work group featuring a lot of our 9 staff members from our occupancy team, our public housing team that work on the program. So I'm really pleased to have had their input throughout this cycle of updates. We will talk about these updates. These will be effective July 1st, 2026. One of the big things we had to do this cycle is incorporate significant changes to HUD references. As you know, HUD has made significant changes to the guidance they're issuing to housing authorities. A lot of this guidance focuses on limiting HUD's role in enforcing the Fair Housing Act. That includes HUD withdrawing the affirmatively furthering fair housing final rule and implementing an executive order that designates English as the official language of the United States, and also ending enforcement of the equal access rule, which promises equal access to programs regardless of gender identity, marital status, or sexual orientation. So we have throughout these documents had to update where we are citing HUD guidance. We can no longer cite some of the HUD guidance we used to cite in support of our policies. But the next slide, please. We want to say though, we have not changed anything regarding our actual operations or commitment to our participants. We're going to continue using our discretion to affirmatively further fair housing, provide language appropriate services, reduce barriers for housing for justice involved individuals, and ensure equal access to programs for people of any sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. So while many of our updates focus on modifying those references to HUD guidance, nothing is changing for our program participants or for our staff in terms of our commitment to upholding those values within our operations. Next slide. Another thing that we are working with is our routine HOTMA updates. HOTMA is the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act of 2016, and it has been in partial implementation since about 2023 regarding some of its provisions for assets and income calculation. So we have updated the asset limitation at admission, which refers to a HUD table. So currently that's going to be $105,574, and the limitation at which we begin to impute or basically calculate asset income, even if there isn't an asset income that we can verify through other directions. Those changes, while we're updating them in our systems and in our documents, they're not fully implemented yet. They are pending our HUD implementation date for HOTMA, which has not yet been published. Another change, one that we're excited about once HOTMA is implemented, is increases to the mandatory deductions for dependents and for elderly or disabled households. So that will be something that will be nice once we're able to implement that for our households. Next slide. We have added some language for inspection requirements for our Housing Choice Voucher Program, which this also touches our project-based voucher program, where staff have requested local variations in the inspection requirements, basically to require that water heaters have properly installed earthquake straps and drain pans to prevent floods. We also want to make sure we're explicitly getting HUD's permission to inspect dishwashers and garbage disposals for function and safety. Currently, our staff are inspecting those items as unit components. But we want to make sure that we have those things that aren't part of Inspire, the HUD inspection requirement. We want to get those into our administrative plan. That way we have something additional to use to support our conversations with property owners about the safety of their water heaters or the functionality of these dishwashers or garbage disposals. Next slide. We've also made some changes in our administrative plan to incorporate our improved moving to work flexibilities. This means we want to make sure we have full moving to work flexibility to set voucher payment standards. We want to describe our full moving to work flexibility for scheduling inspections. We're not changing our inspection cadence, but we do want to make sure that we describe the full flexibility we have in our administrative plan. We also are preparing for implementation down the line of our moving to work homeownership activity by removing language in our administrative plan that refers to HUD's restriction on down payment assistance. HUD's standard right now is that housing authorities may not implement down payment assistance. That's the language that's currently in our administrative plan, but we have moving to work permission to transition our homeownership program into a down payment assistance model. So we're modifying that language. There are some areas that support operational clarity for our staff. One is to clarify that the repayment agreement of $10,000 for participants who owe money to the Housing Authority applies to the total tenant debt. Before, our staff had some lack of clarity over whether they could, for instance, approve two $7,000 repayment agreements. And we've added some consistency and clarity there. Similarly, we have made sure we define eviction more clearly in our documents. This will refer to the court-ordered writ of restitution. We're just clarifying that to make sure that staff understand that that is the point at which we're defining the legal eviction, not necessarily the point where the sheriff has to enforce that writ of restitution. We've also made sure that we're specifying consequences, of not signing required documents. Our current administrative plan language, it's very clear that households must sign specific releases of information at program admission, but it's less clear about the consequences of revoking that consent down the line. So we've just made sure to specify that households have to continue to consent to the release of those documents or risk of program exit.
Sorry, can I get a clarification on eviction?
Yes, yes, of course.
So is this if you have to go all the way to that level to get someone to who's for non-payment or damage on a unit? So it's not like you have to get that just to say, I want you to leave my unit.
No.
It's if it gets all the way to that stage, this is your criteria.
This
Is that-
specifically comes into question because HUD has a mandatory termination for households who have been evicted from their assisted housing. And when staff are trying to determine whether a household has been evicted from their rental housing, our staff in our rental assistance division haven't always been consistent. Some staff have started a termination requests earlier in that process than they should have. And down the line, our hearings officer or someone else who's reviewing that file has said, no, they're not evicted yet. Or conversely, some staff have not considered somebody evicted because they left in between the court order and the sheriff coming out. And so we're just trying to make sure that we define that line for a HUD mandated termination of assistance in a way that is clear and specific for all of our staff.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. It won't really directly impact our lease enforcement process. Our public housing program, this is changes in our admissions and continued occupancy now we're referring to. We've aligned our public housing occupancy standard with our other programs. Currently, our housing choice voucher program has a very standard occupancy standard of 2 individuals per bedroom, plus 1 potentially for the head of household to have their own. Our public housing occupancy standard currently has the same basic rule, which is 2 individuals per bedroom plus 1 for the head of household. But it has some mandatory exceptions for age or sex, and we have removed those mandatory exceptions. The public housing program also currently has different rules for when a foster child can be included as part of the occupancy standard. So we have just sort of modified those exceptions that both programs are aligned. The public housing occupancy change will not affect households who have already had their occupancy calculated prior to July 1st, 2026. Those households will remain with their current bedroom size approved until or unless they choose to move or their household composition changes. We have also modified our admissions and continued occupancy plan to refer to the merged waiting list. That's been an exciting change we implemented in the last year, and we've made sure that our ACOP supports that now. We've also simplified the description of our reasonable accommodation process in that document. There were ways that the ACOP emphasized the availability of the written reasonable accommodation request form that staff felt, I believe correctly, were obscuring the fact that you do not need a written request for a reasonable accommodation. So we've simplified that language. Our request today, of course, we can take any questions, but we are requesting your recommendation to provide this update to the Housing Authority Board of Directors for approval. But I'm glad, of course, to any questions related to your confidence in that action.
Any questions? Thank you.
I just would want to emphasize one key point that I made 2 slides ago about the importance of aligning between housing choice vouchers and public housing. One thing you learn when you go through a disposition process and you're actually converting people's subsidy from public housing to a tenant protection voucher. Tenant protection vouchers follows HCV, housing choice vouchers. So when we have to then go through a reconciliation process when we're not aligned, when we go through that process. So to the extent that housing authority policies have as much alignment as you possibly can, really does help down the road to be able to have that kind of flexibility to switch if we need to.
Okay, well, if there are no questions or further comments, I think we are now ready to move to a vote. So the request before us is to recommend providing the HUD required update regarding the administrative plan and admissions and continued occupancy plan. I imagine there's a pretty good acronym for that. As shared here to the Housing Authority Board of Directors, HUD, for an approval to submit to HUD. Is it to HUBOD? I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, that I got that acronym wrong. To approval to submit to HUD. I need a motion. From someone on that.
I'll move to approve.
Thank you, John. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you very much. Okay. With that, the motion has been moved and seconded. Is there, we will now move to vote on the motion to approve sending the admin plan and ACOP to HUBOD. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, say nay. All right, thank you. With that, the motion has passed. Okay, I'll take that down. So with that, I think, are there any other general questions or comments or new business members would like to discuss? I think with that, I will now ask for a motion to adjourn. Very good at these motions. Thank you. Can I have a second? Can I second? I second. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thanks.